The terminal was filled with the usual mix of busy travelers, voices blending into a cacophony of announcements, footsteps, and rolling luggage. The air smelled faintly of coffee and the subtle metallic scent of the escalators. Mia stood at the gate, her heart heavy with the weight of an impending separation, her gaze locked on Ethan. He was trying to smile, his eyes betraying the sadness that neither of them could fully hide. Mia reached for his hand, feeling the familiar warmth of his fingers slip through hers. This was supposed to be different, the beginning of an exciting chapter. And yet, the looming reality of the distance between them felt like a weight that had already settled in her chest. "I'll call you the minute I land," she said, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts. "I know," Ethan replied, his voice tight. This is harder than I thought." Mia took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. This wasn't supposed to feel like an end. It was just a goodbye for now, a temporary measure. She repeated the words in her mind, as though they could solidify the illusion. But the truth of it was sinking in faster than she could fight it. The final boarding call echoed through the speakers, and Mia turned to face the jetway. She paused for a moment, catching one last look at Ethan before walking away. The distance between them felt infinite, each step carrying her further away from him, from the life they had built together. As the door closed behind her, Mia closed her eyes, a single tear escaping as she imagined the moment when their voices would no longer be a simple phone call away. Mia arrived in the bustling city and was immediately swept up in the whirlwind of her new life. The apartment was small but filled with light, the windows offering a panoramic view of the skyline. Mia unpacked in a daze, the excitement of her new career opportunity still carrying a sense of disbelief. But no matter how fast she moved, the emptiness of the place haunted her. It felt too quiet without Ethan's laughter filling the space. She called him that evening, her voice echoing back to her as the screen lit up with his familiar face. He looked as tired as she felt, the early morning sun casting long shadows across his face. "I miss you," Ethan said, the words coming too easily, a rawness in his voice that Mia could hear despite the miles between them. "I miss you too," she whispered, her fingers tapping the screen as if it could close the distance between them. The call ended with a promise. "I'll call again tomorrow." A fleeting moment of connection before the digital silence swallowed them whole. The days that followed were a blur of meetings, presentations, and navigating a city that was both exciting and alien. Mia threw herself into her work, immersing herself in her new environment to distract herself from the ever-growing ache in her chest. And then there was Jake. Jake was a colleague, a constant presence in Mia's work life. He was charming, easy to talk to, and had a way of making her feel seen in ways that she hadn't realized she needed. At first, Mia brushed it off as harmless, just another colleague. But as the days passed, those innocent conversations began to linger in her mind, a temptation she hadn't expected. One evening, after a particularly difficult day at work, Jake invited her out for drinks to unwind. It was just supposed to be a casual thing, two colleagues letting off steam. But as the evening wore on, Mia found herself drawn to Jake in a way she hadn't been expecting. The easy way he made her laugh, the way his eyes lingered just a moment too long, it was a comfort, an escape from the loneliness of being far away from Ethan. It was late when they finally decided to call it a night. Jake walked her back to her apartment, and as they stood at the door, he leaned in, his lips brushing against her cheek in what was meant to be a simple goodnight gesture. But the moment lingered, charged with an electricity that Mia couldn't deny. Before she could pull away, Jake's hand found hers, pulling her closer. The kiss was soft at first, uncertain, but quickly deepened as the tension between them grew undeniable. It wasn't a moment of planned betrayal, but it felt like one nonetheless. Mia pulled away first, her breath shaky. I shouldn't have done that," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, but his eyes didn't look apologetic. "Neither should I. But it felt right, didn't it?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned, unlocked the door, and slipped inside, leaving him standing there in the hallway. The door shut with a soft click, but the weight of what had just happened pressed against her chest. Mia sank to the floor, her hand shaking as she reached for her phone. She hadn't spoken to Ethan today. She hadn't heard his voice, felt his warmth, or seen the smile that used to light up her world. Instead, she had kissed Jake. The shame washed over her like a tide. She had crossed a line she never thought she would, and now the emotional distance felt insurmountable. The air in the room grew thick with unspoken words, each of them hanging between Daniel and Rebecca. For all their attempts at normalcy, it felt as though the air was charged with something new, something that hadn't been there before. The tension was palpable, rising as they stood by the window, the city lights twinkling below, giving the night an almost magical hue. Yet this was no magic. It was the reality of a marriage on the brink, and the promises of old memories seemed to fade with every passing moment. Daniel turned to Rebecca, his fingers tracing the edge of his glass absent-mindedly. "You haven't been this distant in a while," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca's breath hitched, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared out the window, her eyes focused on something far beyond the horizon, something that wasn't in the room with them. It was a look Daniel recognized, a look that had haunted their marriage for months now. "It's nothing," she said, though her tone betrayed her. "I'm just tired, Daniel. This week has been exhausting." Daniel took a step closer, his heart thumping in his chest as he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. "You don't have to carry it all alone, you know. You never did." Rebecca looked at him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time in what felt like forever. "I don't know how we ended up here, Daniel," she whispered. "I don't know how we lost ourselves along the way." Daniel's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her that he knew how they got here, that it was his fault, that he'd let the distance grow between them. But the words didn't come. Instead, he stood there, his hand still hovering over hers, unsure of what to say next. Rebecca broke the silence first. "It's not about blame, Daniel. It's about the things we never said, the things we should have said." Her voice cracked as she spoke, and Daniel's heart ached for her. For both of them. "I know," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been blind to it. And I've been a coward, avoiding the things that needed to be said. But I'm here now, Rebecca. I want to fix this, whatever it takes." Rebecca looked down at their hands, her fingers curling around his, the touch tentative but real. "You don't have to fix it all at once," she whispered. "But I need to know that you're willing to try. That you're still willing to fight for us." Daniel nodded, his eyes locking onto hers. "I will. I promise. I'm not giving up on us." She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, as if testing their truth. Finally, she gave him a small, weary smile, the kind that was half-faded but still held remnants of hope. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll take it one day at a time. No promises, but let's see if we can find our way back." For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt a flicker of relief in his chest. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. It was a start, and that was enough for now. The next few days passed in a delicate dance of tentative gestures and half-spoken words. Daniel found himself noticing the small things he'd once taken for granted. The way Rebecca's eyes lingered on him when they shared a quiet moment in the kitchen, the way her hand brushed his in passing, as if testing the waters before diving deeper. There was a fragility to their interactions now, but there was also something else. A glimmer of hope, a flicker of the connection they'd lost. One evening, after a long day at work, Daniel returned home to find Rebecca sitting on the couch, a book in her lap but her eyes unfocused, lost in thought. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of the lamps casting shadows on the walls. For a moment, he just watched her, taking in the way the light caught the curve of her cheek, the quiet way she sat, as though the weight of the world was pressing down on her. He didn't say anything at first, just crossed the room and sat beside her. The air between them was still charged, but it wasn't suffocating like it had been before. Instead, it was almost comforting, like they were beginning to understand the silence rather than fear it. "Hey," Daniel said softly, his voice almost tentative. Rebecca looked up, startled, as if she hadn't realized he was there. Her gaze softened when she saw him, and she gave him a small, weary smile. "Hey," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. He reached over and took the book from her hands, placing it on the coffee table. "Long day?" he asked, his fingers lingering on hers for a moment longer than necessary. Rebecca nodded, but her expression was distant, as if her mind was elsewhere. "Just a lot of things," she said, her voice tinged with exhaustion. Daniel shifted closer, his heart pounding as he gently placed his hand on her knee. "You know you can talk to me, right?" he said quietly, his voice raw with the weight of everything unsaid between them. For a moment, Rebecca didn't respond. She just stared at the floor, her lips pressed together, as if struggling with something she couldn't put into words. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes searching his face, as if looking for something she wasn't sure she'd find. "I don't know if I can do this anymore, Daniel," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I can keep pretending that everything is okay when it's not." Daniel's heart sank, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't. "I'm not asking you to pretend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm asking you to be real with me. I'm asking you to give me a chance to prove that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere. Rebecca's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, Daniel thought she might pull away, might retreat into the walls she'd built around herself. But instead, she reached out, her hand trembling as it found his. I'm scared, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm scared that we've gone too far, that we've lost too much. Daniel squeezed her hand, his own fear mirrored in her words. But he didn't let go. We haven't lost anything yet, Rebecca. Not if we're still here, still willing to fight for it. She didn't say anything, but her grip on his hand tightened, as if she was clinging to that small thread of hope. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back. The following week was filled with small steps, each one slowly bridging the distance between them. Daniel made a point of showing up, physically and emotionally, during the quiet moments when Rebecca needed him the most. They spent more time together, talking about everything and nothing. He listened, really listened, and in return she started opening up, letting him in a little more each day. One evening, they sat at the kitchen table, sharing a simple dinner of pasta and garlic bread. The conversation was easy, flowing naturally, with no undercurrent of tension or fear. It felt like something they hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Real peace. I've missed this, Rebecca said quietly, her fork paused midway to her mouth. She looked at him with a soft smile, her eyes holding something new. Something real. Daniel met her gaze, his chest tightening with emotion. Me too, he said, his voice rough. I didn't realize how much until now. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared understanding settling over them. Neither of them needed to say more. They both knew that things were far from perfect, that there was still work to be done. But in that moment they were together. And that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and the healing process, though slow, continued. It wasn't without its setbacks. There were still nights when the silence between them felt too heavy, too thick to break. But there were also nights like this one, quiet, comfortable, and full of unspoken promises. Daniel and Rebecca sat on the balcony, the city stretching out before them. The stars above seemed to shimmer with a gentle light, and the cool breeze carried the scent of rain. Rebecca rested her head on his shoulder, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like they were exactly where they needed to be. We'll be okay, he whispered, his arm draped around her shoulders. Rebecca smiled softly, her eyes fluttering closed as she leaned into him. I know. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel believed her.